You're listening to Iceland News Review, the weekly news podcast of Iceland Review. Subscribe and tune in each Friday to get the latest from our fair shores. I'm Andy Sophia Fontaine, and these are the week's top stories in Iceland. First up on Iceland News Review, presidential elections, reading the polls. As reported, Iceland's presidential elections are coming up on June 1st. Now, Iceland's president is not a political office per se. Rather than representing a political party, Iceland's president is supposed to represent the nation as a whole. How important the office actually is to Icelanders is another story, and we will get to that later, but that's the crux of the matter at least. In any event, polls are an important part of election season, but, as any political scientist will tell you, what questions these polls ask is crucial to getting a clearer picture of the situation. So, let's look at 3 different polls about Iceland's presidential race. First off, there's a new poll from Maskina. It shows that Energy Director Halla Hrund is still the forerunner at 30%. She is followed by former Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir at 27%, political scientist Baldur Þórhallsson at 19%, and former Reykjavik Mayor Jón Gnarr at 11%. This poll, as you might imagine, asked respondents who they most wanted to be president. That brings us to our second poll, which asked respondents who they least wanted to be president. In that poll, also conducted by Maskina, Katrín Jakobsdóttir was at the top, at 42%. Jón Gnarr followed at 32%, with Baldur Þórhallsson in a distant third at 14% and Halla Hrund at 12%. Taking these 2 polls together, you could be forgiven for thinking that Katrín, only a few points behind Halla, is actually in worse shape than it seems. But this brings us to our third poll, and it's a very interesting one. This poll from Gallup asked respondents how interested they were in the presidential elections as a whole. Now, this is an important question as it gives some idea of what voter turnout might look like in general and for individual candidates. The results showed that 63% of Icelanders were very interested in the presidential elections. Of course, interested in the elections does not necessarily mean will go out and vote for a president. There is, in fact, a well-known phenomenon where the weather on Election Day affects voter turnout, and that's even true in Iceland, despite us being very familiar with bad weather. Where it really gets interesting is in how supporters for individual candidates responded to this question. 77% of supporters for Katrín Jakobsdóttir said they were very interested in the presidential elections, as did 67% of Baldur Þórhallsson supporters. These are the only 2 candidates whose supporters' interest in the election went above the national average. For supporters of Halla Hrund, it was right at 63%, and for Jón Gnarr supporters, it was below the national average at 54%. This would seem to indicate that those who intend to vote for Katrín Jakobsdóttir are probably more motivated to go vote than supporters of Halla Hrund, closing the support gap between them and putting Katrín in the lead. But again, we can't forget the poll about who people least want to see become president. Will that play into this? With presidential elections 3 weeks and a day away, all we can meaningfully glean from all this is that it is definitely going to be an exciting election day. For the political scientists who analyze these polls and talk about them on television, but most of all, for the Icelandic people. Our upcoming issue of Iceland Review will go over in detail who these top candidates are. Next up, good news. The labor dispute between aviation workers and management has been settled. As reported, negotiations between the Union of Aviation Workers and the Public Servants Union Sammeke on one side, and Isavia, the company that operates Keflavik International Airport on the other side, had recently ground to a standstill. Things got so bad, in fact, that negotiations were called off and the unions were preparing a series of work stoppages that would have halted departures from the airport for a few days this month. However, the state arbiter intervened, and with their help, both parties were able to work out a deal that both sides were happy enough with, for the time being at least. Speaking of good news, it seems that of this recording, after 54 days of activity, the Reykjanes eruption, which began on March 16th, has at last drawn to a close. Civil Protection recently flew drones over the now former eruption site and saw no signs of any activity. However, this doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. A very large swath of the eruption area is covered in lava, which is still in the process of cooling. This means it is still quite dangerous to try and walk on it, especially as the surface can appear completely cooled while still being dangerously hot underneath. Moreover, there is still a very large magma accumulation under nearby Svartsengi, measured in the millions of cubic meters. This magma may rise to the surface and create another eruption with little to no warning, or it may simply sink or cool down. A new bill will soon be introduced to Parliament with the aim of completely eradicating scrapie in Icelandic sheep within a few years' time. Scrapie is a highly contagious wasting disease among sheep and other animals. There is no known cure, sickness is almost always fatal, and one sheep catching the disease usually means culling the entire flock. Recently, however, some Icelandic sheep were identified as possessing genes that were resistant to scrapie. This has led the government to draw up a plan of action whereby Iceland's current sheep population will hopefully, in a few years, be replaced by scrapie-resistant sheep. The bill outlines a process whereby at-risk farms would be obliged to begin breeding sheep with this genetic strain with the support of the government. The aim is that the Icelandic sheep stock will become so scrapie-resistant that within 10 years' time, government action on this subject could be reduced to simple screenings for the disease. Lastly, on Iceland News Review, if you were in Reykjavik during the past 4 months, you may have noticed it yourself, but there were a lot of sunny days. In fact, you would have to go back to 1947 to find a sunnier start of the year in Reykjavik than 2024 has been so far. At the same time, other parts of Iceland have not been as lucky. According to a report issued by the Icelandic Met Office, Iceland's capital has been blessed with some 512.1 sunlight hours so far this year. Only 1947 had a sunnier start of the year. That said, sunlight is not necessarily equivalent to warmth, of course. The temperature in Reykjavik in April was, on average, 3.1 degrees Celsius. This is about half a degree under the average for 1991 to 2020, and 1.3 degrees lower than the average for the past 10 years. The first 4 months were, however, also not as rainy as the average from 1991 to 2020, with precipitation only reaching 70% of the average for that time period. In other parts of the country, the situation was decidedly different. Heavy snowfall has been the hallmark of the Northeast this spring. Akureyri, located in north-central Iceland, experienced 17 snowy days in April alone. This is 3 times more than usual, and also meant that there was not a single day in town that month when the ground did not have at least some snow on it. Not to worry, though. Meteorologists predict a very sunny summer in Iceland. If you like hearing about news from Iceland, maybe you'd like to visit sometime. Well, what if I told you that you could win a free trip to Iceland too? Visit our webpage at icelandreview.com to learn more, but hurry, this contest ends on May 17th. Next up, the weather this weekend. Friday, we'll see the southern half of Iceland move from clouds in the morning to rain in the afternoon, which will get heavier as the evening wears on. Winds will be light, however, and it should be warm around the whole country. Come Saturday, the rain should stop, but it will remain cloudy for most of the country, with the exception of the northeast. Rains will return for pretty much the entire country as we move into Sunday, although east-central Iceland will not only be sunny, but also warm enough to rise into the double digits. As for road conditions, bear in mind that all roads into the highlands are closed to regular traffic, so don't try heading up there unless you're in a glacier tour group or something similar. Apart from that, road conditions are fair all around the coastline. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, or X. For all your travel needs in Iceland, be sure to visit n.veður.is. That's en.vedur.is, as well as road.is and safetravel.is. Through these 3 websites, you'll get up-to-the-minute information on weather and road conditions, as well as possible incoming natural events. By staying updated through these sites, you'll not only save yourself a lot of time and money, you'll also be able to enjoy Iceland with peace of mind. That's all for me this week on Iceland News Review. Be good to each other.